Well, welcome. This is the second in our fall series about disability rights and bringing in some folks from outside. Last time I was the outside person, which is a little bit of a contradiction, but this time we were really honored to have Judy Heumann with us. And Judy has done so many things in her career from so many different perspectives that if I did the full bio of her, that would actually fill up the entire time. So I won't except to say that she is the Special Advisor on Disability at the State Department now and has been so for several years, and as a consequence is the conscience of the State Department on disability issues.
A little bit of trying to be more.
Right. And of course, with all the discussion about the CRPD and the U.S. role in it, is, this is an important position to be in, not only with respect to what the U.S. is doing on disability, but also being in touch with what other countries are doing. She's also, from the very international perspective there, has also been very locally involved, and for several years was the head of the District of Columbia Department on Disability Services. We were just talking a little bit about the fact that in our clinic we've had some cases concerning some people who are served by the Department of Disability Services over the years. Before that, in addition, she's been the World Bank person on disability. She was also in the Clinton administration, head of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, really the key agency within the Department of Education regarding special education. She may or may not remember this, but I was a special hearing officer in a dispute between the Department of Education and Virginia's Department of Education at that time, which we won to a whole point until the last, when some Fourth Circuit judge decided to dissent as an en banc the court adopted that. But then Congress amended the law to actually do what should have been anyway. So there you go. And then way before that, and some of the students know this because during orientation in the Disability Rights Clinic, we showed the Power of 504 tape, where those who are watching can see Judy as one of the people who was occupying the regional office, the San Francisco regional office that was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, at a time when some of you were still not quite born, which is an important part of the story about disability rights, which is the activism, very similar to the activism in the civil rights movement, of getting regulations which had been on the books but which were not being implemented, or actually were being promulgated. And required essentially people to be in the face, literally, of the governmental officials to get them to do what they should have done. So with that and advocacy, we co-founded the World Institute on Disability and the Center for Independent Living. Again, it's a very full resume. But also a wonderful, again, as we're here in a school in Washington, the idea of people who are in and out of governmental positions, and I would say are advocates, whether they're in a governmental position or not. Sometimes the nature of their advocacy changes by their position, but they're always there representing the most important perspective on the rights of people with disabilities. So with that,
thank you. So let me start off by saying I'm not a lawyer. So thank you very much, Bob. And I would like to speak probably 15 to 20 minutes and then open this up for discussion. Are there any burning issues that you would like me to try to address as I speak with you? Do you want to lay out now, or wait?
Donald Trump's view on disability.
He's my hero. Okay, so let me say that I had polio in 1949. I'm 67, almost 68 years old. And I mention that because it's really important. I've seen in my life the changes that have evolved in the United States and the amount of time that it takes to make significant changes. Both the physical and legal changes that have been made, and then to get laws not only passed but implemented. And I think one of the issues in the area of disability is this, even in a country like the United States and numbers of European countries and others, the stigma around disability is still very significant. And of course, in many countries, the stigma around disability is very, 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 very pronounced, making it really a priority to need to be able to look at how to ensure that disability rights organizations can develop. But equally importantly, I think the role of parents for children who have disabilities. And I saw a film last night called My Right Foot, and it's about a disabled woman who was born without arms and the role of her parents. And I think when you meet with many adults who have disabilities, who have them for most of their life, not always, but typically regardless of the country, you'll see that there were parents who were not necessarily acquainted with disability at all, but made a personal decision that they wanted their child with a disability, regardless of the type of disability, to be able to be equal members of the society. And so, my parents and millions of parents around the world really are the ones that children, as we grow up, frequently are looking towards, because while I certainly didn't understand much of what was going on when I was very young, as I got older, it was very clear that my parents were not accepting things that were being put before them. So in the area of children, I think it's very, very important to be able to support the rights of parents with disabilities, but equally in the legislation which is being developed to ensure that, like in the area of education, in the U.S. law, there's specific language and funding that addresses the establishment of technical assistance centers for parents so that they can learn about their rights and get assistance and advocacy. They're too small. They certainly can't serve all the parents who need assistance, but I think the concept of these programs and the work that they are doing is very important. And you don't really find a lot of other countries that have this model. So I've been in this position as the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights for the last 5.5 years now. And just very briefly, this is the first position that the Department of State has had, which focuses on disability. And our job really is to work on the inclusion of disability in the human rights and foreign policy and diplomatic work that the State Department does. It's on the website, and so it's pursuing diplomacy that is inclusive and empowering of persons with disabilities. We oppose discrimination against disabled people. We work with governments. We work with civil society. We work with employers and others. My broad history growing up as a disabled person who experienced the effect of no legislation in the area of disability in areas like access to education. So when I was growing up, there were no laws that said disabled people had a right to go to school. And so when my mother took me to school and the principal said I couldn't go to school there because I was in a wheelchair, I think that was the first time that my parents really kind of woke up to the fact that while they felt it was important for me to be integrated into society, and I was in the neighborhood and other religious activities and things, when we came up against the system wasn't ready. So over the years, my mother and father were learning that, A, they had to advocate for me to get into school. So I finally did get into school, but it was only segregated classes for disabled children. And they were not only segregated classes for disabled children, but there really was no accountability as it pertained to whether or not the curricula that we were studying was the same curricula that the non-disabled kids in the school were studying. And so I was like 9 years old when I started to go to school, and the classes that I went to had students in them up to 21 years old. And the school itself was a school that went up to the 6th grade, so students in the rest of the school were like 12. and then they went on to junior high school. But in the special ed classes, there were no students at that time who had ever graduated and gone to high school. Students stayed there till they were 21, and then they went to sheltered workshops, which are separate places where disabled people work and typically are not receiving the same salary as non-disabled individuals. And at that time, even worse than today, the jobs that people were being given were in many cases a joke, because they had people like with cerebral palsy and spasticity supposedly stuffing envelopes. Well, of course, they couldn't stuff envelopes. Whether or not they should have been stuffing envelopes is even a separate issue. But then their salary was based on the number of envelopes they could stuff. And so these people were people who were, by the Department of Labor, able to be certified as not having to earn minimum wage. And I was 9, and I didn't know anything about that at that point. And I was kind of bored. And so I started working with some of the kids who were older, who really hadn't been taught how to read. And so all those things really were kind of forming a foundation for me, where I was beginning to kind of question, first of all, why was I in this segregated program? I mean, I'd just come off of 3 years of what we call homeschooling, but homeschooling is really different because here parents have made a choice if they want to homeschool their kids. My parents did not make a choice to homeschool me, but because I only got 2.5 hours a week of a teacher being sent to my house by the Board of Education, my mother, in essence, was my teacher. And then they found out that if you were in a wheelchair in New York City, they had no high schools that were accessible, and so you went back on home instruction. So my mother then, she was learning, and she met other mothers, and they advocated with the Board of Ed, and the Board of Ed, as a result of that, made schools, a selected number of high schools in all the school districts accessible, so that myself and friends didn't have to go back home. But I was the first student in my health conservation 21 class in Brooklyn to ever go to high school. It's a whole other discussion that we can have. But, basically when we look at the issue of rights and people need to be able to fight for their rights. In order to be able to do that, they have to value themselves. And I think, one of the issues in the area of disability is, disabled people, most families don't have individuals with disabilities in them. And if they do, like invisible disabilities, people don't necessarily think of them as disabilities. And people don't look at disability as a political rights issue. I think, for me and for advocates around the world, we look at the word disability as, a word like women and African American and Latinos, on and on, because it's a term that we wear with pride, and we try to get other people to identify with being a disabled person. So I am not a person with disability person. I don't use people with disability languages because I personally feel that no other minority group puts person who's a woman, person who's a Latina, they don't do that. And so it's something that I never own, and it's another issue for discussion. In the United States, if you saw the 504 film, you'll see very much that this was a very young group of people who were not like experts in political organizing, although there were some people in the group that had been involved in political organizing, not from a disability perspective. But for those of us who had disabilities and were kind of learning as we went, we were looking at other movements. We were looking at the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and others, although one thing that we saw on a regular basis, that disabled people were not a part of any of these movements. And so, we were, on the one hand, working to advance the rights of disabled individuals. then you had these sub things going on. So sexism in the disability movement was and probably still is alive and well around the world, but since disabled women were not really a part of the women's movement, we were having to kind of come to the side and talk about these things, discrimination by disabled men, discrimination by the system overall. So there were a lot of side things that had to go on and still go on. But I think today, what's very interesting when we look at the issue of gender and disability, you certainly see in many countries, like in Africa, where disabled women's organizations or a part of national coalitions includes disabled women's chapters or sections, which I think is very important. But as we were advancing in the 1970s, we, as I said, were learning from what others were doing, and there were lots of little organizations that were being set up around the country. One of the small groups were Disabled Student Service Offices. And the Disabled Student Service Offices really were an opportunity for people to come together at the universities and begin to talk about not just what it was like going to school, but what was it like going to a school that wasn't accessible, and what was happening for students with various forms of disabilities, and the barriers that we were experiencing. And that type of a discussion even earlier, when some of us went to these segregated camps for disabled kids, the bad side was they were segregated camps and we couldn't go to camps with our non-disabled peers. The good side from my perspective was it was really an opportunity for disabled people to come together and really kind of be the majority of the people in the community. And it was a whole different kind of discussion that could happen because, we would be together for 1 to 3 to 5 to 6 to 8 weeks. And as we got older, our discussions became more sophisticated, and we really were looking at issues about not only the fact that there were barriers, but why were there barriers, and what did we need to do in order to address the barriers. And at this point, I'm talking about the 1960s. And so a lot of technology really had not been designed yet. I mean, things like motorized wheelchairs were just kind of in the U.S., just really beginning to come into being. And issues like ramps on streets, accessible buildings. Disabled veterans were doing work in that area, but in the U.S., like in countries around the world, disabled veterans and civilians typically do not work together for lots of reasons, which we can also discuss. But in New York, there was something going on where there was some good working relationships between the disabled veterans organizations and some of the new and emerging younger disability rights organizations. And all of those things coming together, I think, really helped to create in New York and other places an opportunity for people, I call it, coming together to go apart. So coming together as disabled individuals and discussing what we saw as the barriers, and then looking at what we needed to be doing, not just within this little enclave of disabled people, but what we needed to be doing to argue with the city or the state or the federal government, or learning about how do you make a bus accessible. Because we couldn't get on, some of us couldn't get on buses, but it wasn't like in the area of race where you passed a law that said it was discriminatory if you didn't allow someone to sit anywhere they wanted on the bus. Anybody could tell me I had a right to get on the bus. I couldn't get on the bus. And so a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in disability really are different. And so the first law, Section 504, which in my view is very much the precursor of the ADA, and had 504 not been a law previously, with some really great minds working on the development of regulations, I don't think ADA would have looked like it did in 1990. And typically there's not a real discussion about how those two come together. But I think, especially for those of you who come from other countries, I think it's really valuable to look at the progression of ADA of 504 and ADA It doesn't need to be that way, but I think, laws can be set up now that collapse those two together. But I do think it's very important to have an understanding about what are some of the unique features in the Section 504 regulations, things like reasonable accommodation and other provisions. So we saw in the 60s and the 70s an emergence of the voices of disabled people. And one other, I think, very important part of what was happening at that time was the emergence of what I call a cross-disability movement, because at that point, up until the 70s, and certainly still today, there were many, many different organizations that were focusing on single disabilities, and many of them were also very much focusing on the medical aspects and not the rights-based rights-based approaches. I think those organizations, those charity organizations, also did not venture forth at that time into a rights-based approach. They thought that they would lose money by doing that, and I know that in part because my mother was very involved with a group called the March of Dimes, which at that time in the United States was an organization that had been set up in the 1930s, addressing issues around polio. And she organized our neighborhood, and people went and did fundraising, basically door to door. And when she started getting more involved with other mothers, I'm trying to make the schools accessible, she went to the March of Dimes and asked them to get involved, and they told her they didn't do that. And so they stopped collecting money in our neighborhood. But it's all those very important little pieces that I think are very valuable to understand in the context of the work that you're doing and where you're living, and where people are at a certain point in time, because all these different things that are happening as a result of the CRPD and others, they don't happen quickly, they don't happen magically, and they happen because there is a core group of people, and hopefully not just disabled people, who really have a clearer understanding about the types of discrimination that exist in a community, and don't say that we have so many issues on our plate that addressing issues of discrimination in the area of education for kids with developmental disabilities is not our issue today, because we have all these other children in countries who are not in school at all, and therefore how could you expect us to be looking at this population? And in my view, if you look at the issue of rights, we need to be looking at the issue of discrimination, denial of rights. Who are those rights whose rights are being denied? And what value is there of coming together to be able to advance multiple agendas at the same time? And so in the job that I have right now at the State Department, I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is, with our small team, is really not look at creating separate stovepipes on issues around disability, but looking at how to integrate disability into work that's happening. So, the State Department is it's a very critical part of its work, looking at human rights violations. And one area that the State Department will do a lot of work on is looking at false imprisonment of people and trying to name and shame and get people out of prisons, or in some cases, mental health institutions. What we're trying to do is also to allow people to see that being in an institution because of disability is still resulting in people losing their rights, and people living in inhumane conditions who may be sentenced there for the rest of their lives because they have X disability. And that it's important for people that are doing human rights work internationally to really have a better understanding of the types of violations that people are experiencing. So issues like I know some of you are dealing with around guardianship and things of that nature are very important. Ultimately, I think when looking at people who work State Department and USAID, at DFID, whatever the international body may be, is to really get up and close in a way that they typically haven't done in their day-to-day lives on an ordinary basis. Most people maybe have heard about people being in institutions. People in the United States and some other countries have heard more about terrible conditions in nursing homes, as an example. But people typically don't know what the alternatives are. And so I think in many ways people turn, I don't know if this, a blind eye on a blind eye. Although if it was a real blind eye, it would probably be good because people would be more sensitive. But so in trying to help the department get a better understanding that if you go into a mental health hospital where someone may have been by government put into that institution because of alleged whatever, and we want to get that person out of there because they've been inappropriately charged and they're political prisoners, we should not be going in there and just looking at that one person. We should be looking at the entire institution. Yes, maybe we will get the person out who shouldn't be there, but failing to understand that who should be there? No one should be there. There should be alternatives in the community so that people can be living in the community. That's a hard concept, and I was just saying earlier that a year ago when I was in Mexico, and you're going to meet with Eric Rosenthal, I think next month he's going to talk about the work that Disability Rights International has been doing, and they've been doing a lot of work in Mexico and one of their countries. I took a group of staff from the embassy to visit this institution. And it was a terrible institution. And people from the State Department had never visited an institution, let alone a really bad institution. And so getting them to go there and to observe and get a better understanding in a very limited amount of time that the way to address this institution was not to get rid of the smell of urine and put clothing on people and paint some walls, but there's a real need to have a clearer understanding of how can the U.S. government influence the Mexican government and civil society to be developing programs that can appropriately support people in the communities. And there is some movement in that regard where there's a greater understanding, a little bit of an understanding about why these institutions are wrong and beginning to get people to look at what the alternatives are. I think in saying all of this, it's disability inclusion, facilitating, supporting disabled people getting their rights. Also, I think really necessitates people having more knowledge than just what the law says. You really need to also have more in-depth understanding about what alternatives are, so that in the legal work that you're doing, you can, I think, in an appropriate way, be helping to ensure that systemic reform is in part what you're addressing. Because even in the States, with all the laws that we have, we know that 60% of kids in juvenile facilities have some form of disability, which is another whole discussion about who are people with disabilities. And I think we look at disabled people, most of whom have invisible disabilities. And that's something also that people don't really think about. So in conclusion, before we open this up for discussion, I think we're making a lot of progress compared to where we were previously internationally. But when I visit countries around the world, one of the big issues is laws that are weak, but even if they weren't weak, laws that are not being enforced. Laws that are not being enforced in disability, typically the country is not enforcing other laws. It's not just the issue of enforcing disability rights laws. But we're also finding that there are many governments that are willing to discuss disability issues that are not willing to discuss other issues. They don't necessarily see disability as a human rights issue, and they see it in another way. Of course, we see it as human rights violations, which is what they are, and ultimately what they need to be discussed as. But it means that the community that supports human rights around the world also needs to be really more inclusive of disability. Open Society Foundation, I think, is a great organization where you can really look at the fact that they are integrating disability more into their work, just like Human Rights Watch and more of the human rights field. So let's open it up.
Great. Questions?
Comments. First, give me your name.
I have one.
Your name again?
Laura.
Laura, yeah.
So we talk about these alternatives to the people that are in jail. I work in jail in Colombia, and I have a client with disabilities.
And you have what?
And I have clients with disabilities inside jail, and they ask me about like if it's better like be in jail or go to like an institution. And it was really hard for me because like, prison life is really hard, more for a person with disabilities. But in mental institutions in Colombia, like at least when they're in jail, they will be like 5 years, 10 years, they know that they will be finished. But in the mental institution, they will be forever because it's up to the doctors to know if they are okay or not. So I want to know what could be the alternative, because living in the community, that in Colombia, they are still facing these stereotypes when they are living in the community. So it's really hard thinking about like how to live in a community that is still thinking that a disability is like.
So, if you look at the cases that you're handling, have these people committed a crime that they've been prosecuted for and have a term to serve?
Yeah, there are all the scenarios. People that commit crime, people that have failed incriminate. But there are the scenarios that already commit a crime, that they want to go to a mental institution, not to stay in jail. So they have two options to don't be prosecuted if they.
So, Professor, you and I should think about this together.
Yeah, I mean, I will say one thing that, in my experience from a criminal justice standpoint, is that sometimes lawyers for clients who have disabilities have been so focused on keeping people out of jail and prison that they've often said, well, as long as any other system has to be better. And yet that often wasn't true, especially because of the possibility that you might spend much longer in institutions than you would if you were in prison or jail. But I will say, and I don't know if your views about this, I mean, some of the statistics you quoted and seeing how many people in prisons, and particularly in jails, have unmet, undiagnosed mental health needs, with facilities that are nothing like the kind of staff you would need to address them. That's not great either. And I think our big failure, I think, as a country has been we had the right philosophy eventually about community-based services, but we didn't fund it at the level we needed to. And as a consequence, we've sort of trans-institutionalized people from, it used to be the large hospitals, then it was nursing homes, and I think, and this is again for people with psychosocial disability, I think it's a different issue for people with intellectual disabilities, and sometimes that distinction gets lost. And so there's not a great answer to it except that we have to address that, I think, at all levels, including our police bring people in for crimes they wouldn't otherwise pursue with someone who didn't seem to have a disability, but they think this is somebody who they may even be well-intentioned. This is somebody who needs help. He's on the street, needs to be somewhere, but without really the follow-through of are they going to get the help you think they're going to get? And that's another huge problem.
I mean, it seems to me that one thing to look at is the record of this person. So is it the first offense? Have there been multiple offenses? And what role can you as a lawyer play in setting up some kind of a plan for this person, which potentially could be monitored if by nobody else than you, that could be helping to provide some kinds of services for someone to help prevent them from recidivism. And have you worked on that? I guess another question would be, are there any mental health organizations in Colombia that you might be working with?
No, I work like in a legal clinic, so we are students that work inside the jail in the mental health unit. And the point is that we are not lawyers, so we don't represent them, but we give like legal advice. We can just try to help them with the legal issues that they have. Because actually the lawyers are worried. Like they have a public attorney, but the normal thing that they say, you just say that you're guilty. Actually, there are a lot of cases that they just sign, like, when they declare guilty to the crime that they didn't commit. We have cases like this too. It's worse because they already say that they are guilty, so we don't know in that point that we can help. But no, actually, there are not a kind of institution like that.
Well, I mean, I think it's like a case-by-case situation, and I mean, for me, I would be worried about putting somebody into a mental institution if there wasn't a way of ensuring that person would be able to get out, especially if there's a defined amount of time in the prison. On the other hand, depending on the prison and whether or not the prisoner could be committing other offenses in jail. I mean, that's, I think, one of the issues that we're discussing. These issues are not simple. And so as you move forward in your careers, making a decision about what area you want to be focusing on, mental health is such a very critical issue. And there is work going on now more in the United States on addressing, as you know, just generally, the overpopulation of prisons and removing people from prisons who have served their time and maybe never should have been in prison in the first place. But there's also work going on around the number of disabled youth in prisons. I think in addition to the issue of funding, one of the fallouts of not having sufficient funding is that it's the poorer families who really wind up typically not getting appropriately served, because middle income and wealthier families will learn about what their rights of their kids are. They're more likely to be able to bring in outside people in the area of education, for example, to address issues that are happening. Whereas I think, when I visited juvenile facilities in the 90s, clearly what you saw were kids who either had not been identified or maybe had been identified when they were in school, and maybe even had the legal requirements for a program developed for them, but they stopped going to schools and the families didn't really know what their rights were, or they were working too many jobs, or whatever it might have been, and the kids just fall out. They become truant, they're not in school. Typically, schools aren't held accountable. So, and I think in many other countries, the questions about who's dropping out of school is never even asked. So it's kind of, they become children of the street or trafficked or whatever it may be. So I think like anything, it's an individual, you have to look at each case individually, do your very best, but ultimately look at that's really what I've done and what Bob's done. You kind of learn as you go and figure out the areas that are more challenging for you and where you feel like you can make a difference.
Can I ask you, you mentioned it, so I felt in an interesting way, so I want to push a little bit on the terminology question. So I think within the disability rights world, there seem to be sort of different strengths. And for people who come from the sort of intellectual and psychosocial disability side, and I'm generalizing, there's been more of an embrace of the so-called person first, or person with a disability. For people from the more physical disability side, there's sometimes been more of a focus on saying disabled person, with, and you can correct this, but a sense that the limits of your disability, or many of them are societally imposed, and so it's almost the society disabling you as opposed to that being something inherent. And some of you, of course, know that so much of the movement in disability now is away from a medical model and more towards a social or interactive model of disability, where there's the impairment piece, which is often, in a sense, the least important aspect. It's really how a person adapts and how an environment adapts to that person. And everybody, I think, is agreed that things like the disabled doesn't work for anybody, because it kind of lumps together people without any kind of individualization. And the last thing I'd say, and then ask you to answer, is I guess at least with regard to referring to people as person of color, that there is some other person first language in other groups beyond this group.
But I don't think people of color call themselves people of color.
Well, that would be,
Right.
that would be an interesting question.
So,
but so
I mean,
anyway,
I don't
that's-
think you see Latinos saying, I'm a person who's a Latino, I'm a person of color. I think many people from racially diverse backgrounds define themselves from the group they're with.
Right.
But, so, this is my feeling on that subject. It's not just people with, who have physical disabilities that define themselves as a disabled person. And so the issue of language, so I would say there are a couple of ways of looking at language. One is internally within the disability community, we discuss the terminology we want to use. Disabled person, deaf people. I mean, deaf people do not call themselves, they call themselves deaf people with a capital D,
Right.
or a lower D, blind people.
Right.
That's just, it's kind of a natural thing for many of us. But in the 1970s, there was a push that came out of the community of developmentally disabled people, where they were legitimately discussing the fact that people didn't treat them as people. And so they wanted to be identified as a person. Completely, I understand that. But it wasn't really discussed in the context of politics, because the people that were leading those discussions were mainly non-disabled people, who were helping people, facilitating people, and helping to look at issues around terminology. So it became a very contentious issue, and I have friends who used to say disabled person all the time, called themselves a disabled person, who would go to meetings where there were representatives from the DD community, not necessarily, not typically, people who had developmental disabilities themselves, who would basically be chastised for using disabled person. I was at a meeting in Canada with a friend of mine from Finland who also was disabled, and it was just natural that we use the word disabled people. So we were in a much bigger discussion, and we were using that word, and this mother gets up and chastises us. So this is a very important point, because the mother really believed that if she called her son or daughter a person with a disability, that would be it. That was like the magic pill. If I said, you're a person with a disability, everybody around understands what it means to be a person. Of course, we know that's ridiculous. And we had this little argument where we basically said, you can't tell us what we're going to call ourselves. This is why we call ourselves what we call ourselves. And I think within the community itself, the way I address it is, I will call you whatever you want me to call you. If you have a disability and you want me to call you blue cheese, I will call you blue cheese. But if you don't have a disability and you start using terms like the able-disabled, the blah, blah, or what Paul Longmore called the all boogered up. I don't know if you have, so this is a guy that, he passed away, but he's a historian, and then he got into disability history. And he was interviewed for something, and he was using all the different euphemisms that people use around disability, and he concluded by saying, ball boogered up. But I have had discussions with people who have developmental disabilities, where I've used disabled people, and someone said to me once, "Why do you use that?" And I explained why I used it. That was the end of the discussion. Because I gave I said, "You call yourself what you want. This is why I use it. I think it's more political, blah, blah, blah." And the other thing, really, when people with disabilities language started in the 70s, I said, it is too long, too many words. People will not use that. Now, who can tell me what people with disabilities is written? How is it written today?
PWD.
Exactly. So we have gone from a disabled person, a person with a disability, to an acronym, PWD or CWD. In my view, do I want to be known as an acronym that nobody understands? No, because it completely takes away from the argument that this is a political issue. But there are people who are, very, in my view, the issue is, what are the laws, what are the rights, how do people get to express their views, how is society, how is government forced to make the changes they need, and that we need to be political in what we're doing and express ourselves in that way. We've spent too much time also. I was in Vietnam when I was working at the bank, and I'd given this presentation on the work that we were doing, and I didn't know anybody in the room. And this guy says, "What should I call you?" So, just as a side note, at that time, my full name is Judith, but I get called Judy. But on my card, I say Judith. And so I thought, how does he know that some people call me Judith? So really, that's all I could think about is Judith, Judy. What should he call me? So I said, "Oh, you can call me Judith or Judy. I don't care." And he said, "No. Should I call you a disabled person or a person with a disability?" And I said, "I don't really care. What I would like is that you look at the presentation that I just gave about what the bank needs to be more inclusive." But this issue of terminology, I think, speaks to people's lack of comfort in addressing issues around disability and the ability to speak to someone who has a disability. So in reality, what should I call you? Most people would think my name, right? And that's why I went to Judith or Judy. Yes.
So this is fascinating, the naming of the other, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm thinking, and I don't know whether this is true or not, I don't work in the area of disabilities, is if this is a discussion that is as strong here as it is in other countries. And if it's not, I wonder if it has to do with the history of this country with with racial discrimination and the dichotomy on how horribly the word that was used to refer to African Americans changed this narrative in a way that you can't say other than African American if you are. So for me, for example, it took me years. I've been in this country for 18 years, and I for many years I was like afraid to say black, which would be the word that I would use in Spanish with any racial content. So I was wondering if this sensitivity on the naming of the other is stronger in this country because of the history of racial discrimination that gets translated into others, or if it's something that you perceive that it happens the same in other countries as well.
I would say that, unfortunately, it has nothing to do with that. I would say that there's been changes in terminology in the United States and other countries, and in other countries the wrong, like invalido is still a prominent word in many languages.
Discapacitado.
Yes.
Yeah.
So invalid, which is a term that's used in many countries. So in the U.S., and let's just talk to the U.S., the words that were previously used were cripple. It went from crippled to handicapped, and then it went to disabled. and then people with disabilities. But the younger movement that I was talking about earlier, we pushed against the word handicap because we considered a beggar's term, hand in cap for begging. And in Europe and Scandinavia, they were using the word disabled. So I was the president of an organization that a group of us founded, and for 1 week, it had the name Handicapped in Action because we had lost a vote. However, then, as chair of the board, I polled the board, and we changed the name to Disabled in Action. So really, the reason I said, unfortunately, I don't think it had anything to do with that is I don't think at that point our movement was a part of the other civil rights movement in an in-depth enough way that we would have been getting into a discussion on terminology. I think, in part, really, for me, because the disability movement has been becoming a more cross-disability movement over the last decades, individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities were really not a part of the movement. There were many more people at that point in institutions, and I think the discussion and the terminology was driven by the physically disabled community. But
you know, it's interesting. First of all, the major terminological move within the intellectual disability movement was to move from mental retardation to intellectual disability. And there was quite a lot of political activism on people who felt that there was no way to get away from the stigmatizing term mental retardation or its short forms, which were often not used as a clinical diagnosis, but just as an epithet, right? Just like gay has been used as an epithet. And that's where, you know, movement to ban the R word and all that became very important. Although I do remember when the transition was going from mental retardation to intellectual disability, having a discussion with a person with a disability, intellectual disability, who said, well, I don't want to be known as an intellectual, which I thought was a very interesting thing to say to an academic. But of course, it was that sense that there must be something pejorative here was so powerful that without knowing more yet, or to say that people wouldn't interpret that in that negative way, that's how that person was. And indeed, one of the self-advocates that I'm on board with, for a number of meetings, used to complain about the term individual. He said, I don't want to be known as an individual. And I would engage him and say, well, because most people would say individual is a good thing, right? It's not, you know, you're separating out the person. It doesn't have this kind of negative valence that some of the other terms have. And I finally said, so tell me what's bothering you about that term. And he said something really interesting. He said, well, when I'm interacting with staff, they call each other by their name. The only people they ever call individual is me. Let's move the individual here or there. So in you know, I say in his mind, but very understandable in his experience, it wasn't they were saying bad things, but like that's the same thing as saying you're calling me, you know, a person we work together.
The other.
And
yeah.
I think this is a fascinating discussion that I'm sure people are writing about, but I think some of these terminologies are driven by legislation. Because we have, in an agency, people who serve people who now are called developmental and intellectually disabled. There's legislation that specifically works with people who have a developmental or intellectual disability or a mental health disability. And so it's got to have a label.
Right.
I don't call myself a physically disabled person. I say I have a disability. Blind people and deaf people frequently use those terms in it, you know, before their disability, blind, deaf, whatever. But you know, for me, a discussion like this is really valuable because at the end of the day, what this man or woman said to you is, "I'm treated differently." That's the crux of the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah. Do you play poker?
Do I play poker?
You've got a great face. You were being very expressive, and I was just trying to think.
Wait, sorry. are you saying I would be a terrible coach?
I have no idea because I didn't know what you were making your faces.
Lauren is
Not good. Oh, I was very interested. I was conveyed interest.
Lauren is my co-teacher in the disability rights section.
So my question to you, as a disability rights advocate and also a non-lawyer, which I think is a critical piece, and so important for you to be here to talk to us, is your sense, or if you have a sense of how laws set up ostensibly to either establish rights, support people with disabilities or those in the community. So many of the laws, like the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, are set up to be very individualized and particularized to the individual rather than to a class or a group of people, even though ostensibly it covers the class. And how do you see, or do you see that those laws interact with the movement's ability to kind of move forward as a cohesive group? I mean, do those laws actually maybe unintentionally create barriers to sort of organizing and moving forward from a rights-based perspective?
So I see the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act versus individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities a little bit differently, because one of the issues around, in this case, education, is we don't want people to be presuming that because someone has a disability that requires them to get certain kinds of supports in order to be able to make achievements. We don't want people to put everybody with this label into the same basket. We really do at that point want them to be looking at people individually. Because when we talk about education overall for all children, we talk about the importance of moving away from teaching all 30, 50 kids in the classroom the same way, because children learn differently. And so for me, with the IDEA, that's much more in conformity with the broader educational direction of individualization of education, even though most children don't get an IEP. So that's the way I would add that one particular part of the question. I think what I'm speaking tomorrow on a panel at the grievance board for the Department of State, and there are 4 of us that are going to be talking about, we're not talking about any particular cases, we're talking more broadly. And the questions that they sent to us, that they wanted us to be looking at, in my view, were questions that really made me believe that people who would be reviewing a case, whether it's at the grievance level or previously, through people, didn't say this, but the way I read the question, through people, for example, like with mental health disabilities, kind of all into the same basket. So that if somebody were coming before them with PTSD, there would be this preconceived notion that all people with PTSD were the same. And there, what I'm thinking is I need to speak with them about the importance of looking at people individually, because you do need to look at the person, what they need for supports or not, how the managers and others around them were working with them, where the problems were. But there you need individualization. So I think when looking at issues that affect a person, where you don't want to be pulling people together in a group, is a dividing area for me. So when I started off talking about, I see disability as a political issue, so for me there, you dump everybody into the kettle, right? We have different ways of addressing discrimination, and this is really one of the key parts of the 504 legislation, ADA, and any of the major legislation in any country around the world. As long as we only look at the individual remedies, so blind people need Braille, deaf people need sign language, someone with physical disability needs a ramp, blah, 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 then we're not really having the discussion about what is discrimination and what are the remedies to discrimination. And some of the remedies to discrimination are very broad. You want appropriate standards for new construction and renovation that a whole wide range of people, architects, people who have different types of disabilities, can come to agreement on. Yes, we need a curb cut, but if I'm blind and I'm going up the curb cut, I need X to be able to make sure that I'm not in danger. Yes, if I'm deaf or have my reading level is at such and such, I need these things. But if you come to the table with each individual group arguing for what they need, we found, and other countries find, that legislators have a great opportunity to say, if I do this for you, they're going to be upset with me, or they're going to be upset with me. When we were able to come together, throwing us all into what I'd say like the pot, and we talked about discrimination, we all experience discrimination, and there are different remedies for the discrimination. And some of them are very broad, like laws and regs and implementation. But some of them then become much more individualized, like what Laura was discussing, people who have mental health disabilities and where should they go. I mean, there you wouldn't have a blanket answer either. You would want to look at the individual person. So I think it's complex. Any other thoughts for me?
Could you talk a little bit about CRPD ratification?
It's not happening this year.
No.
So I guess if I were to look at the CRPD ratification, I would say that one of the reasons we failed is because the broader human rights community did not really embrace what we were trying to do. So the human rights community, the international human rights community, I think is the way to put it, they weighed in a little bit, but they were not hugely involved. So do you all understand the issue? The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, this UN treaty, which has been ratified by 159 countries. When the treaty began to be developed, at that time, George Bush II was president, and he had said that he sent delegation to the UN for each meeting as the treaty was being developed, and over time gave them more permission to be able to speak. But the basic premise under that administration was the U.S. did not need, nor would it, ratify the CRPD because we have the laws that we need, and we, as the United States, can provide technical assistance to other countries. That was, I think, basically the way to sum up what happened. Then, when Obama was elected, so there's two steps in the U.S. When a treaty is ratified, countries first sign and then ratify. And every country has a different procedure for ratification. And in the United States, the procedure for ratification is only the Senate addresses the issue of ratification. And it's not a majority vote, it's 3/4 of the Senate must vote to approve any treaty. So it's a much higher standard because there's a premise, there's the Constitution, that we don't want to be willy-nilly, ratifying treaties. But in 1990, as you know, with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it was a very significant part of the discussions around the development of the UN treaty. And the U.S. in the 90s clearly was the leader on the issue of disability rights in many, many different ways. And I believe still is. But we also felt that it was important for the U.S. to ratify the treaty, one, to enable disabled people from the United States eventually to benefit from implementation of the treaty in other countries, because now as countries still have major barriers, it's a problem for disabled people to be able to study work abroad, for parents who have kids, blah, blah, blah. But also, we feel that it's very important that the U.S. needs to ratify so that we can play a different role with other countries that have ratified. Meaning, A, of course, we can learn from other countries and what they've been doing and advancements that they've been making. But B, which I think is very important, if we've ratified, it then gives us an ability to also talk to other countries in a different way. And since what we're seeing in many countries is countries sign the treaty, but really are not taking seriously the development or implementation of legislation, our ratification really puts us in if and when we ratify the treaty, it puts us in a different position. Why did it fail? One, as I said, because I believe the international human rights community did not embrace this issue, which should have been a non-controversial issue. Because at the end of the day, basically what the administration was saying is it would require no changes to U.S. law and would require no additional funding. So it was not taking on new obligations. But it allowed, because we didn't have enough involvement either from the international human rights community or the disability community in the United States has really not done much international work. So they haven't traveled abroad. They don't really understand the issues that people face overseas. There's really not a lot of ownership in it. And so a lot of the work that was done was really trying to get people in the local communities in the U.S. to be able to ramp up their ability to have a meaningful discussion. And given that the opposition, so 100% of the Democrats supported the treaty, and I would say about 10 of the Republicans supported the treaty. But the others, A, wouldn't pay attention to it until it was going to be on their desk, and it wasn't coming to their desk. And then they got into some very, if you see this film that I saw last night called My Right Foot, which is about a woman born without arms. It's a great film, but part of the film shows her going and lobbying Republicans. And it was very interesting to see how these guys were willing to put forth a statement that, yes, we understand that people are saying that ratification of the treaty will result in no changes, but you have to understand that we don't believe that, and all these nefarious things that some of the, there were people who literally believed, at least they say they do, that by ratifying the treaty, it would give the UN authority to come into the United States and take children away from families. So for Halloween 2 years ago, I wore a hat that had a helicopter on top of it that was black that said UN. But I think if there would have been more, if the disability community understood the issues more, there would have been more volume. Because one of the big oppositions, as you know, was the homeschoolers, which is really a small group in the United States, 100,000 people. But when you don't have a lot of opposition, those people are very well organized, and they would call the conservative Republican offices and tie those phones up for a long time. So I think the treaty will be ratified. You know Jill DeBrancana?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so Jill is an attorney over at the State Department. A colleague of mine and myself had lunch with her yesterday, and she said, it will happen. But it's not going to happen in this term. So hopefully the elections in the fall of 2016 will make some changes and we'll be able to do it. But it's the right thing to do, and the administration believes in it.
And when you sign, you are committing to go through. You can't just sign, you really should be intending to ratify. And I think that certainly was the President's intention, certainly.
Totally.
It's, and I think the other thing that, your comments reflect, and what I've heard, is that for senators who really don't care one way or the other, it wasn't important enough for them to cast a vote that even could possibly be subjected to criticism from the right. So it's like, okay, I've got push from the right, and I might agree with you that they're not really telling the full story, but I don't get any credit for this vote. And I know we probably lost a few people for that.
And I might risk for that.
Well, actually, it is 2 o'clock, so thank you very much, Judy. And,